My recommendation to young artists is stay loose. Don't worry about making mistakes. Have fun. Have a ball. Get excited. Work yourself up. Feel the excitement of creation. If you approach your art gingerly, with fear and timidity, you'll never find yourself. Go ape. Go crazy. Mistakes can be corrected. Artist Frank Frazetta.
Hi everyone. Welcome to Virtual Muse AI. We're celebrating 1.7k subscribers here, so we wanted to do something special. That's what this is. We're joined by author and friend of the channel, J.R. Tross, to dive into some common bad, rotten, no good advice beginner readers commonly get, and the more nuanced things we try and keep in mind instead, based on 3 decades of writing experience between the two of us. And then there's Abbie. Who knows how much collective experience she has.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I mean, what more need be said after Abbie's killer introduction? I mean, I totally agree. As I guess the rest of this is just going to be elaboration on the hows and whats. But yeah, I'm J.R. Truss, Julian to my friends, which includes you and everybody who's watching this.
Except for me.
Yeah, right. The hell with you, Silas. I don't even know why I'm here. All the random people out there that I've never had the pleasure of physically meeting, yeah, they're my close friends and confidants, and you, who I've known since we were literally babies, you can just go screw yourself. But yeah, so I am J.R. Truss, and I am probably most well known for the Ilfraver trilogy, which is an arcane punk cyber fantasy. A niche sci-fantasy story about a pacifist monster hunter in a futuristic fantasy universe.
It's every bit as amazing as you would think from hearing that abstract.
Well, and that's high praise coming from you, Silas, because you write quite excellent books as well. And I did just want to say congratulations. Your channel seems to be blowing up, and all the success and more is very well deserved. So, just kudos and well done.
Well, that's appreciated. Anyway, the idea here is to provide a sober, reasonable, non-preachy discussion of the topic, which could be just what beginner readers need to make sense of things they've been told to do or not do in their writing.
There's nothing worse than feeling overwhelmed by conflicting advice. Hopefully this video will provide a clear and practical guide for aspiring writers. If you're a subscriber, thanks for being here. We are grateful for your support, and we are excited to share our creative journey with you. We want you to feel welcomed and valued as part of our community. If you aren't subscribed yet, I hope you'll do that and join our growing channel.
Yeah, smash that like button. Click the bell.
So in the spirit of things on this channel, Abbie and I will join forces to pick some pieces of bad advice for us all to talk about. But first I want to clarify what I actually mean by bad advice, because I think advice can be bad in 2 distinct ways, and it's valuable to distinguish between them. One way for advice to be bad is to be fundamentally flawed. The best illustration I can think of is, your problem is having mildly nasty breath, and the advice is to gargle bleach. It's just bad advice. It won't help solve your problem. And it might lead to a whole set of new problems. The other way advice can be bad is to be bad at being advice. The core idea of it is good, but it's bad at conveying what it actually means to beginners. And it ends up being unhelpful or confusing, or worse, actively misleading. I think it's way more common for beginner writer advice to be bad in this way, rather than the other way. But even a lot of the advice that has a useful idea at the core of it is still bad for beginners, in the sense that it isn't rendered in a way that makes it easy to pick it apart and take it and use it as it is. With that said, the piece of advice that I have a bone to pick with first is, write what you know. if you have enough perspective, it's easy to see the good idea at the core of that. All art, whether you're writing or painting or sculpting or whatever, derives its power and resonance from the artist's capacity for introspection. If you cut your art off from that most basic lifeline of your personal connection to this thing you're creating, of course it's going to be shallow, derivative nonsense. In that way, write what you know is great advice. It also works in another way. If you were a police detective for 30 years, you're definitely going to be able to write a more detailed police procedural than someone else. But if you have to write what you know in the way most people use and understand that advice, then you probably can't write anything besides police procedurals. And it gets worse. Someone who knows more than you about the craft of storytelling will be able to write a more compelling police procedural than you can, even without your years of experience in it.
Yeah.
This may have been better advice in other centuries when no one could reliably know anything if they hadn't directly experienced it themselves. But now the sum total of human knowledge is available to anyone who wants to learn from it. There isn't any detail about anything anyone has ever done that you can't learn, if you're open to the knowledge and willing to put in the effort. I think if this advice was going to be rendered in a more useful way, it would be, know what you write. Don't just make up details or pretend to understand things you don't. Readers pick up on that, and it registers as weird or bad writing, even if they don't know exactly why. Better yet, put the focus of whatever you're working on, where you personally have a connection to what you're creating. This piece of advice wouldn't fit on a bumper sticker anymore, like it would have when we started, but I think a beginner could actually put it to use now.
Yeah, it's very pithy, right? It's very succinct, but I think it has achieved a level of brevity, shortness that makes it no longer very useful, right? Write what you know. Does that mean understand, or does that mean something you can intuit, or does that mean something that you're an expert in, right? It can mean so many different things. And going back to the police procedural, for example, that's a very good point that you brought up, and I just add to that. Like, what if the police officer in question, or the detective, or the PI, or whoever, doesn't have any experience doing like a murder case, but they have done other forensics, or they're very well familiar with it because they've been hanging out with people who, for years or decades, who've done those kinds of things. Just because they haven't personally engaged in that type of forensic work doesn't mean that they don't have like a ton of useful or interesting knowledge. And they might also just like make up a random killer who never existed, rather than deliberately plagiarizing from reality, which leads to a slew of other complications. If you only write things that literally happen, well, for one thing, you open yourself up to litigation. I mean, not always. I don't want to scare people from writing nonfiction, but you know what I'm saying, right? Like, if you only write exactly what you know in fiction, then people are going to say like, hey, it didn't happen that way, or there's just going to be issues. You can deviate from your literal experience, for sure. With, for example, the book that I keep bringing up, The Rave, in the Elf River trilogy, when I was writing Alina, I think what I knew, if you could say, what I was doing as writing what I know is, Alina, like me, is a sarcastic, a sarcastic hope punk, like an idealist in a lot of ways. And so the truth of her character, to put it in highfalutin terms, is her weaponized sarcasm, which is a weapon and a defensive mechanism. And she also shares my hope for a better future, even in the face of pretty horrible evidence to the contrary sometimes.
One piece of advice I find unhelpful is write every day. While consistency is important, sometimes life gets in the way, and forcing yourself to write when you aren't feeling inspired can lead to less than stellar results.
Rest and recharging are important. People aren't perpetual motion machines, and they should never feel guilt about that fact. Plus, that advice, in my opinion, puts too much emphasis on physically sitting there and writing words on a blank page, as if that's all writing is. And if you aren't literally doing that every day, you aren't a writer. I don't think that's true. You can be putting mental energy into characters and stories at times when you aren't physically writing. In my own case, I think the majority of my writing, quotation marks, writing, happens when I'm not physically writing. So measuring it in literal hours at the keyboard would be hugely misleading. Putting the words down is only the end result of a mental process that goes on outside of sessions of sitting at a keyboard. It's an afterthought. Writing doesn't only happen when I'm literally physically typing. I think this advice could be more useful rendered as develop consistency and discipline in starting and finishing your projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember looking at the Word document for the rave a few years ago, and the number of hours. I don't know if Word still does this, because I do not still have a Word subscription. Once they moved to a subscription model, I jettisoned away from them, fools. But back when I still had Microsoft Word, I looked at the tracker, and it was in the hundreds and hundreds of hours, some ridiculous number. But to your point, I remember thinking at the time, it's way more than this, because it doesn't count all the hours I spent writing notes in a journal. I filled a couple of Moleskine journals with preliminary ideas. It doesn't count all the charts that I drew, and the connections between characters, all the random notes that I scribbled, all the walks that I took where I was thinking about all this stuff. So yeah, writing at the keyboard, sure, that's the mechanical process, as you put it, where you get the words on the page, and then you edit the words, and you format the document, and whatever else. But it's such a small, it's a significant part of a much larger whole. And I guess related to that, I've also gotten advice similar to that, where it's write X number of hours per day, write 1,500 words per day, or 1,000 words per day. Different people will tell you different numbers. But I don't know. Some days I write 5,000 words when I have a full day ahead of me. I think my all-time record was I stayed up for 20 hours and I wrote 11,000 words. That was one of the Bagman books that we co-wrote way back when. I was just all right, I gotta get it done. And I did. But there are other days when I barely get out 500 words. I think just a couple days ago I was working on adding something to a scene that you suggested, Silas. And I added some really good stuff in there, but that day I quote unquote wrote maybe 300 words. But it felt like a good day, because I had really fixed up that scene. So yeah, I think that the advice to write a certain number of words or spend a certain amount of time per day, that can work for people. But if you're kind of a regimented personality, and in my experience, creativity and regimen, you have to sit down and be disciplined at some point. You have to, I would say, find a schedule that works for you, and that be open to that schedule being flexible, because life happens. And probably the worst thing you can do, speaking from personal experience again, is beat yourself up because you didn't meet your quota, right? I mean, people get sick, things happen, life comes up. The trick is to stay motivated and enjoy what you do, and then get back to it when you can. Right? Make time to write when you can find the time to write, and live and be a full human, because that's going to make you a good writer too. I guess maybe if I was going to be pithy about it, I would just say writing probably shouldn't feel like a 9 to 5. Maybe that's the bumper sticker.
Another bad piece of advice is kill your darlings. That can be really hard for new writers to understand, since they haven't yet developed a strong sense of their own style and preferences. Plus, cutting out parts of the story you love can be heartbreaking.
True. Kill your darlings is such bad advice for beginners, because it's purely catabolic and destructive. There's nothing constructive about it. It doesn't add anything to the algorithm, it only subtracts. If you don't have the foundation of skills and preferences and personal style in place for reduction to actually be useful to you, then it just reads as, if you like something in the story, take it out. Or even worse, go for cheap emotional gut punches by killing likable characters all the time. It's a double whammy of bad advice for beginners because it's a coin flip. If it's just unhelpful or actively will make the writing worse. I think this advice could be more useful rendered as, don't fixate on how the story is right now. Always remain open and flexible about how ideas will develop and transform over the course of the project. At least for me, there's generally a fair amount of iterating on an idea before I feel like it's reached its final form. Also, arriving at what I ultimately like best isn't necessarily the same thing as arriving at what I envisioned to begin with. The idea will definitely have elements of what I envisioned in the first place, but it will almost certainly expand and transform from what I imagined at the start. So I have to kill my darlings, in the sense that nothing in the story is so dear to me in its present form that I'm not willing to kill it and have it reincarnate in a form I didn't expect, so to speak. Maybe repeatedly.
Murder imagery. Yeah.
Didn't Stephen King originally say this?
I think it was. I want to say it was one of his predecessors. You know, one of the great classics. Let's see. I have Google at my disposal. Kill your
So
darlings.
that brutal, horrifying imagery definitely isn't a random accident.
Jeez, come on. Google's being very unhelpful today. Maybe the source is less clear than I thought. I was gonna throw it onto Ralph Waldo Emerson or something. William Faulkner. It's often attributed to William Faulkner, but it could be traced back to English writer and surname collector Sir Arthur Quillett Couch. Sir Arthur Quiller Couch. So, okay, so, some guy who, created a very pithy phrase, that's for sure. But if we follow that advice to its logical conclusion, right, and if you're somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience writing, you might very well interpret that as find what you like about your story and take it out. Because this particular turn of phrase or this particular idea that you came up with, it's good and therefore it must go. which is the worst advice, ever. But I think your contextualization of it makes a lot of sense. If we follow it according to the strict interpretation, then, when Terry Pratchett was writing Reaper Man, and he said, the narrator says, "For what can the harvest hope but the care of the Reaper Man?" That's a really good line, and it's even better in context. And, it's about death caring about humanity, and it instills theme and everything. So Pratchett could have looked at that and said, "My word, that's good. All right, time for the cutting, get that out. Get that crap out of here." That would be horrible, and the book would suffer for it. Now, I think where this could be applied is if your book has a scene or if there's a theme in there that is no longer as prevalent, and there's this one particular line that this character says that really gets at the heart of that theme, but you've sort of downplayed that theme. As you were saying, Silas, the story has changed, it's evolved and become something more or different from its original concept. Then probably you would get rid of that line because it no longer fits what the story is now. And so, yeah, you have to be open to that. Don't keep a thing in just because you like the way that it sounds, if it has nothing to do with what you've ended up with. That's for sure. But do not interpret this piece of advice as get rid of stuff you like, because that is the exact opposite of what I think you should do. You should write and for your own enjoyment.
What we are talking about is a part of the beauty of storytelling. It's a living, breathing entity that evolves and grows. As we delve into our stories, new ideas sprout like wildflowers, and unexpected twists and turns reshape the narrative in exciting ways.
Yeah. I mean, this would be like, you can go onto Instagram and see artists who have very particular niches that they do. Like I draw dudes in, armor, right? Well, if they had taken this advice or a similar piece of advice, like kill your darlings in their artistic sensibilities, then they would have been like, I love drawing dudes in armor. Okay, time to stop. And then what? And then they'd be drawing what? Like, I don't know, something completely different, something completely unrelated to what they're interested in. It's a dangerous path.
I think keep it simple is also bad advice. Sometimes complex ideas and themes are dismissed too quickly. Sure, simplicity can be powerful. But it's okay if a piece of writing is not easy to summarize in a sentence or two.
I think that's a really helpful perspective because keep it simple is such a grossly misleading way to make the point. The core idea is helpful. There can be power in simplicity, but that's simplicity in style, not necessarily in theme. Beginners might not be in a position to make that nuanced distinction and thus take the wrong lesson from the advice, meaning it's bad at being advice. As far as it means, keep the way you present things streamlined and understandable, I agree completely. Good writing can make complex themes easy to follow and understand, while bad writing can make simplistic themes seem complex. But if that's what it means, it doesn't quite say that. This advice, the way it is, could be to write well and not write badly. That's obviously a good idea, but a useless way to frame it. How would you render this in a way that is actually helpful to beginners?
Well, I mean, on a related note, I'm a tutor by day. That's kind of my day job. And I tell my students something along these lines, which is the job of a writer is to, as you said, communicate a complex idea in a simple, understandable way, to make a complicated idea as simple as possible. That shows skill and, ability. So that is kind of the heart of a writer's purpose. I am struggling to figure out how you would keep it simple, I guess. Well, okay, so how do we actually do this in writing? Like, how do we communicate theme? A lot of the times you hear show, don't tell, which we could do a whole episode on show, don't tell, I think. I think that's its own hour special. But okay, so how do we actually show theme, for example, or show characterization? It looks simple on its face. You see a character stare forlornly out a window, and you're like, all right, well, so the basic action is they're staring out a window. It's raining outside. So I'm being a bit cliche here just to be simple. Haha. But if they're looking forlornly out the window and it's raining and they're brooding, then maybe that's communicating the emotion of the scene, which is, someone has died recently, but you don't want to have the character say, I'm sad that my uncle has died. Instead, you have them doing this action. In that way, it's simple because anybody could read that and understand how the character is feeling in that moment without having to be told, right? That is a simple rendering of something that's actually pretty complex, which is grief, And maybe there's other emotions wrapped up in there too. Maybe, depending on the situation, there's grief, but also relief because the uncle had been sick for a really long time, right? I don't know if there's a way to say that more succinctly. I haven't come up with it yet. I guess if I was going to try, I would say something like, communicate in as understandable and relatable terms as possible whatever idea you're trying to approach. If it's a story about grief, show the grief happening in ways that people can identify it and relate to it and maybe even sympathize. And if you can do that, then there you go. And I tell my students all the time, I've got 3 rules of writing, and they go in order of priority. There's be clear. That's your first obligation as a writer. Be concise, and then be creative. And I could write a book explaining those rules. And I actually work with my students adding nuance to those rules. But I start with the soundbite just because it gives them a clear priority, right? Like, first you have to make sure that your writing is understandable. You have to make sure that people can follow what you're trying to say. Then you worry about being as concise as possible, right? So eliminating extra words, trimming down, adding as needed. But that's in service to being clear. So, yeah, I don't know. It's difficult to get a cute little phrase and still have it be totally understandable and full of meaning and nuance.
One more. There are no new ideas left. I mean, come on. That's just not true. There are infinite possibilities when it comes to storytelling, and every author brings their own unique perspective to the table.
That's a great reminder. No two people have exactly the same perspective on anything, so every writer can bring freshness and innovation to even the most established tropes. I think evolving technology and the drumbeat of change in the way we all publish and consume writing has opened up a lot of new horizons of creativity and done good things for diversity and representation of humanity in storytelling. And it's doing its part to bring us a little bit back towards the shared, collaborative thing storytelling has always been in the most primal sense. Human beings have been sharing stories since the first moment there were human beings to do it. Now, technology means the campfire we're all sitting around is the entire world, and the tribe is everyone who is currently alive or has ever been alive. But we're still telling stories and riffing off each other to imagine things. There hasn't been a single moment in history where there were more possibilities for new ideas. This statement, "there are no new ideas left," couldn't possibly be less true.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of a misunderstanding of some stuff that I've read. Wasn't it Campbell? He did the Hero's Journey book, Joseph Campbell, and he didn't, the monomyth, right? The bridging of the key stories, right? I've heard it before that people said like, oh, there's only 20 stories. Really, if you break all stories down, they'll fit into one of 20 categories. And some people say 7, like the vengeful brother, the disowned child, the star-crossed lovers, the true heir of the king, right? Like you can break all stories down allegorically to these levels. And then Campbell said, well, really, they're all just one story, the hero's journey. Who am I? And how do I fit into the world? And what can I do to change the world to make it better or worse? And sure, if you abstract to the point of stripping away all the particularities of a story, yeah, I think you can end up with who am I in every story, because that's the human experience. Who am I? Where do I belong? What's my purpose? In one way or another, we're all asking ourselves that, I think, and we have different answers for it. But that doesn't mean that there are no new ideas. That just means that we're all creating and imagining within the context of the human experience. We're making new ideas and remixing old ideas. And I guess I have one bit of a pithy statement that maybe is relevant in this context. I'm sure people have heard this expression, but good writers borrow, great writers steal. The idea being that you take from others, but I always add the little bit at the end where I say, yeah, great writers steal from hundreds or thousands of sources. If by taking sort of a smorgasbord of inspiration from many different sources and many different media, you can end up with something unique, because that's what creativity is. It's recontextualizing and reimagining stuff that you've seen before in a new setting, a new scenario. Let's see. I'm trying to pick a writer from a hat. All right. So you have the headless horseman, right? A sort of a symbol of horror in the colonial era. You have Frankenstein's monster, like a cautionary tale of man's hubris and attempt to play God. It's all commentary on whatever the author is seeing occur in the world at the time. There people always talk about like books like 1984 by Orwell and stuff as like, oh my God, he predicted exactly how the world was going to be. No, what he did was he observed how the world was trending, where politics was headed, where economics and the social condition were going. And then he extrapolated, right? He came up with sort of like an exaggerated endpoint for that type of thinking. So, sure, he was attempting to write a cautionary tale, but he wasn't a savant. He wasn't predicting the future. He was just observing and extrapolating. And, whether you write about political ideas or cottage core cozy mysteries, you're doing the same thing. You're just finding some niche, some avenue, some quiet corner of the human condition to explore and play around in. And I think that's what makes honestly good writing.
Writing can be a daunting task, especially for beginners. Remember that writing is a craft that takes time and practice to develop. Keep writing, keep learning, and keep pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. I want to remind aspiring writers that it's okay to make mistakes and experiment with different styles. Writing should be fun and enjoyable, so don't be too hard on yourself. Just keep writing and learning along the way.
I mean, I completely agree. My grandfather used to say, this isn't about writing, but I think it's relevant. My grandfather used to say, if you can write your name, you can draw. So, I take that and I apply it to writing as well. If you can put words to a page or dictate them or, whatever your method is, if you have ideas and you write them down, you are a writer. So the rest of it is just time, practice, effort, collaboration. You can workshop with others, you can seek professional advice, but just remember that everything that you read and hear related to the craft of writing, you should just take what is useful to you ultimately. Take what is going to help you create the product, the art that you want to create. Make it yours. If you love it and your intention is to send it out into the world, your enjoyment of it is going to help other people enjoy it. Your passion will come through the page, even as your technical abilities increase to match that passion.